The way it works is like the lambs will eat probably around 1.2 kilograms of dry matter per day, and we're getting what we're seeing in the trials that we're doing in Athenry is that there's a sweet spot in terms of yield around 5.5 tons per hectare. That's a good crop.
This year's weather continues to play havoc with tillage farmers' plans. There may be a break in the weather in the coming days, but time will tell. The late harvest on many farms delayed planting of cover crops. However, many did manage to squeeze in the planting, and most of these crops are looking good at the moment. Now the decision for these crops is how can they be destroyed before the next crop, or perhaps how can I make some more money from them? You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Grazing cover crops planted post-harvest has been a feature on many farms for a long time. But the practice of leasing land by specialist tillage farmers to fatten or graze sheep by other farmers is more recent. There are a number of factors to consider in this, and with this in mind, I'm delighted to be joined by Michael Gottstein, the head of the sheep program in Teagasc, to talk about these factors. Michael, before we talk about the cover crops, you might just tell us, how is the sheep sector performing at the moment?
So look at, I suppose, how's the sheep industry doing? We could always be doing better, I suppose, no different to the tillage side of the house. Look, at the margins are tight, and it's not so much that the product price has increased, in the last couple of years quite well, but the input costs are huge, and I suppose that's what has kind of taken the gloss off it. Like, so, in terms of profitability, I suppose this year and last year weren't super years for sheep farmers. 2021 was by far a much better year. But on I suppose what we're going to be talking about in terms of store lambs and the store lamb trade, I mean, people who've been finishing store lambs have had, reasonably good and very good years over the last kind of 10, 12, 13 years. They've been good years on balance when we look at them for farmers, some years better than others. Last year probably was one of the less exciting years, but still a profitable enterprise across the board. Like,
okay, well, look, that's good to hear. It look, probably your enterprise is no different than the tillage then, in terms of there's a cost price squeeze, and it's pretty difficult to kind of make a margin out of it. And just, I suppose, in linking up the two of them, there are lots of cover crops out there. Probably maybe like a little bit less this year than last year, given the kind of the poor spring and later harvest that's out there. And I suppose maybe the first question in terms of bringing store lambs or maybe sheep in general onto the likes of these cover crops, are sheep happy enough grazing that kind of a forage?
Yeah. So generally, I suppose what we find is when you're introducing the sheep on, most of the work we'd be kind of introducing them slowly over a week. So, they kind of concentrate on the grass area. So maybe have a grass run back, or maybe, that they'll concentrate on the kind of grass and volunteer weeds around the outside. And then once they get onto the crop, they're quite happy. But there's a kind of a training in period there where they're, basically looking for what they're used to until they get used to the taste. But once they acquire the taste of these forage crops, they tend to be quite happy to graze on them and tend to do quite well on them. So on all of the brassicas, we're getting pretty good performance figures as well from them.
Okay. And in a lot of those situations, those on tillage farms, brassicas were used a lot in the past, and maybe increasingly now people are trying to turn away from a little bit just due to club root issues and things like that. And there's probably more or different species starting to come into it, the likes of phacelias, there's vetches, there's rye and oats and that kind of thing. Are they palatable or attractive or even nutritionally reasonable for sheep in terms of the job we're trying to do?
Yeah, so in terms of getting sheep to graze them, I don't think there's any major issues. I suppose in terms of the animal performance aspect of those particular crops, I just don't have the data on it. We haven't done any work on that in Ireland. And maybe that's something that we need to start looking at. Michael, if there's a couple of farmers there that are willing to do a few weights, we might do a little bit of performance work on that. But, in general, like, there's two benefits, I suppose, from grazing these forage crops. One is that we tend to get a little bit increased intake. in them. And the second thing is that generally the sheep are going onto an area where there is very little disease pressure in terms of parasites. So there's a kind of a benefit, like when you take sheep off an all sheep farm, or a predominantly sheep farm where there's lots of parasites that are challenging the sheep, you take them onto a tillage farm. So there's a benefit in terms of reduced parasite challenge, and then we're getting increased intake, particularly with the brassicas where we would have the data. But I would suspect it wouldn't be a whole pile different if you were looking at oats or rye or vetches or things like that.
Okay. And in terms of, the grass growth, I suppose, towards the back end has been relatively good on most farms. Will that prolong the amount of time that maybe the store lambs might stay on the home farm, if you like, before they're either brought to mart and sold, or maybe that particular farmer is looking for somewhere else to fatten up those lambs? Is it any different this year than other years?
I don't think so, Michael. I think in general, the people who have grass to finish lambs traditionally will finish their lambs. And, the people who sell the vast majority of store lambs are people that are maybe on hill areas that have less green ground, need the green ground for other livestock categories on the farm, maybe suckler cows or ewes for mating, preparing ewes for mating. And they have to get the lambs off the farm simply because they don't have the green area or the land type or quality maybe to finish those lambs. So while I suppose the good grass growth in the back end may encourage some cattle farmers maybe to buy store lambs, and I suppose from a sheep point of view that would be welcome, because I think there are probably less tillage farmers out there this year with the crops, Michael, simply because of the new changes in the regs. And the kind of confusion that was there over those at the start, and of course the later harvest and things like that. So look at the moment, I suppose store lamb prices are not booming and haven't been booming this year, and part of that is demand, that there hasn't been that much demand, and we'd be welcoming if cattle farmers and farmers across the country would buy store lambs, because it'll take the pressure off the trade at the moment. And sheep farmers I suppose are hard pressed as well, and need an income from those, and need to be able to sell the lambs at a reasonable price. And there is, I suppose, very positive market outlooks in terms of the value that people will get from finishing those lambs, in terms of and the profit that they'll leave, the margin that they leave.
And Michael, not knowing a whole lot about sheep now necessarily one way or the other, but are those store lambs out in the market at the moment, or is there the majority of them likely to come in the next few weeks, or are they gone already? I'm not sure where they are.
No. So look at, the store lambs start coming kind of in July, mostly lowland lambs, August, September, then it really starts racking up. And this year what we would have seen is a delay in store lambs coming out. So talking to some of the mart managers that might normally have had maybe 250 lots in kind of, late August, early September or mid-September, on a mart day, they were down to 160, 170 lots. So, we were thinking a lot of that was maybe weather related. So lambs didn't do very good early on. We had a very bad March and April. And then concentrate feed prices were very high. So lots of farmers that might in the past have fed lambs, chose not to feed lambs simply because of the cost of the concentrates. And then the performance of the lambs would have been back a little bit. And we were thinking maybe farmers were holding them on a little bit longer to just try and get that weight up. So there's two kind of thoughts out there. One is that, maybe there isn't as many lambs out there as we think there is, that, the spring might have taken a toll on that. And the second one is that they were a little bit slower coming. So there's a lot of lambs coming on stream at the moment, and that's really going to ramp up over the next couple of weeks, because farmers are going to need to free up ground to bring ewes down for mating and things like that. So the last thing they want is lambs knocking around. So look, we're really in the peak of the store lamb selling period at the moment, and we will be for another few weeks.
So would you have any idea in terms of where a tillage farmer is growing a relatively good cover crop, say a brassica dominated kind of cover crop? There's a good bit of stuff on it, or there intends to be a decent bit of stuff on it, maybe up to halfway up to your knee. I'm taller than most, my knee's probably higher than most, I suppose, but a reasonably good crop of stuff. What sort of carrying capacity would be on that in terms of, and I don't know how you measure it, is it lambs per week, lambs per day? I'm not exactly sure. What would it be?
Yeah, so look at the way it works is like the lambs will eat probably around 1.2 kilograms of dry matter per day, and it's we're getting what we're seeing in the trials that we're doing in Athenry is that there's a sweet spot in terms of yield around 4.5, 5.5 tons per hectare. So that's a good crop. No, the really strong crops, maybe some of the early sown stuff. If it starts going over 6 and even into 7 tons per hectare, and we'd see that occasionally with July sown, things like red start maybe, or forage rape, our utilization really drops because an awful lot of that yield is actually in the stem, and the lambs aren't really going to eat that stem. It's the leaf they're after, and they seem to knock an awful lot of it and break it down. So the sweet spot seems to be around kind of 4.5, 5 ton dry matter per hectare. And if you take that your lambs are eating 2 kgs per day, or utilizing 2 kgs a day, they're eating about 1.2, and we're getting about 60% on average in Athenry. What we're seeing is about 60% utilization of the crop, because there's a trade-off, Michael, in terms of trying to getting them to utilize absolutely everything and trying to maximize animal performance. So you can really force them to, eat the stems and all of that, but your animal performance is going to be much poorer. And so kind of 60% utilization is roughly the sweet spot. So if you take that figure of 2 kilograms of dry matter per hectare and take a 4-ton crop, which would be a good crop now, I suppose, coming off a winter sown
It'd
series.
probably be from work here, I suppose, Michael. It'd probably be crops that are after performed reasonably well, but would have needed to been sown probably in early August, I'd say, to get to that level.
Yeah, late July, early August, I'd be thinking, yeah. So those type of crops, you'll be talking about 2,000 lamb grazing days per hectare. Okay, so you could put 2,000 lambs in for a hectare for a day, or if you have 1,000 lambs, it'd be 2 days, and I suppose that's the easiest way to work it out. It's roughly around 2 kgs of dry matter per day is what we're allocating. And look at, obviously, if you let them run through, 50 hectares of it, they'll walk an awful lot more of it into the ground than if you're stripping it. But I think, I suppose, again, in Athenry, we give them 2-day breaks. If the weather is very bad, we give them 1-day breaks, but there's a significant workload associated with, giving those breaks. And I'd say on large scale tillage farms with big numbers of lambs, that's probably not as practical.
Sorry, describe that to me now. What's a break?
So we're basically putting a break in within it's like effectively strip grazing them, so they're being grazed in blocks, basically, and we give them a fresh block of crop every 2 days. Okay. And then so that involves basically, running electric fences through it and trying to break down the crop where the electric fence is running. So it maximizes your utilization. It's important for us because we're measuring lots of data on those lambs in terms of intakes and yields and all of that type of stuff. I suppose in a commercial farm, generally people are block grazing it. They're giving bigger blocks, maybe a week or 10 days, or, the block could be the field, or part of the field,
And in terms of supplementation with with further lambs on that kind of fodder, is it needed, I suppose, in the first place? Is it a special mix of stuff that's needed? Is there extra minerals needed in it?
Yeah, so generally I don't think there's a need for concentrate supplementation. Okay, but there would be a need for mineral supplementation, in particular if the lambs are on the crop for a long period of time. So if we were talking about putting lighter lambs, kind of, 25, 30, 35, say south of 35 kilo lambs on those crops, they're going to be on it for a while. And in that situation, mineral supplementation is required. So that can be either by giving them free access buckets, lick buckets, or probably a bolus, and the bolus should probably contain iodine and selenium, just because the brassicas tend to be very low in iodine. That's generally what we would do in terms of the mineral side of things. The other supplement would be long fiber. So, we generally recommend that they have access to long fiber. And they will eat very, very little of that. But in all our trials, we put a hay rack in with some straw. It's just the easiest thing to move in. They eat very little of it, but at least they have that fiber available. Now, if there's a grass run back and there are an awful lot of volunteer cereals after coming up with the crop, then there's probably plenty of fiber in those. But generally, we would advocate that they should have access to long fiber as well.
And it's good that you brought up the kind of the run back, because There was a lot of comings and goings, I suppose, with those runbacks this year. The department had some very strict guidelines, and then they eased a bit, and then they eased a good bit more. And kind of where it sits at the moment is that there's a 3-meter buffer around all external boundaries, which is the first one, I suppose, to mention. And the second one is a 4-meter along a boundary that has a water feature in it. So I think first and foremost that the farmers need to make sure they exclude sheep out of those anyway in the first instance. But then the second one then is this lieback area. It's now gone to, for every, they need 3 hectares of stubble or grass for every 7 hectares of cover crops. And the question I wanted to ask you was, or maybe you might have a bit of information on it, how do sheep utilize that, lieback area? Do they prefer grass to stubble, or have you seen, or have you any research to say that there's a benefit in it?
Yeah, from a sheep point of view, that's actually a disaster, Michael. And we have some experience on that. Like we introduced the lambs in Athenry, the lowland lambs and the hill lambs, onto the crops. They have a grass run back. Like that's the practice we use. If you don't fence them onto the crop, you won't get them onto the crop. So like, from a sheep grazing point of view, that uncultivated or non-brassica containing run back and the inability to basically fence them onto the crop is going to be problematical in terms of getting the sheep onto it. So what's going to happen in effect there is they're going to sit on that run back until they have absolutely everything grazed off it before they venture into the crop, and from an animal performance point of view, that's not what we want. I'd say there's a bit more thinking needs to happen on that. Sheep are not animals that do a lot of poaching or damage, or, and maybe that, allowing them onto a 1/3 of the crop in the initial and using that as a run back would be a better or a solution. But the idea of the sheep having access to grass or some alternative forage that they're used to eating will simply hamper them from getting onto the crop. It's gonna be one of the challenges.
Okay, and I suppose, look, that was the final question that I did have for you around. Lots of farmers, tillage farmers especially, are very conscious about poaching, and I suppose it's obviously they're not as heavy as larger animals. They're not going to go down too far, but a lot of tillage farmers often find that there's a bit of a capping almost for ground like that. Where you have a lot of sheep, on it for a period of time. Is there a way that you've found that to try and minimize that impact?
Well, I suppose the way to minimize it would be to have the breaks, what I mean. And I assume the capping that you're talking about is probably around the areas where they congregate, so feeders and things like that. Generally, I think if they're moving through the crop, we're talking about a 35 to 45 kilo lamb, so the level of weight compared to a bovine is very, very small. I know the hoof area is smaller as well, but generally we wouldn't see a lot of damage being done. Now look at if you get very, very bad weather and they're at the end of a break, it can look quite bad, I suppose, when you're moving them on. But we would generally find a week later it seems to have recovered quite well,
Michael, listen, I really appreciate your time. I know you're on the road there to another meeting. So look, thanks for stopping off and give us a little bit of time on that. And look, we might come back to you and chat to you again maybe later on in the year.
No bother. Thanks for having me on.
So that's it for this week. And my thanks to Michael for joining me on the show. Just a date for your diary. The Teagasc ECT Week Conference will take place in the Killishy Hotel on November the 8th at 10:30 a.m. This event will delve into the increasing problem of grass weeds on tillage farms, including blackgrass, herbicide-resistant wild oats and ryegrass, and more. We will also hear from a number of farmers who have been working with the project over the past 5 years. So finally, don't forget, if you enjoyed the podcast, and recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.